When my grandfather was younger, he became the principal of an elementary school. He was in his late 20s to early 30s at the time, and despite being young, he was a born leader. He was a great principal, and everyone loved him. I can attest to that, as I attended multiple award ceremonies for him, and the respect and admiration he received were immense. There was a young boy at the school who was having behavioral issues in class, and my grandfather saw that the kid didn't have a lot of parental support. So he called in the boy's father and had a talk with him about spending more time with his son, essentially a general parenting session. It turned out that all the boy needed was his dad's attention, and after a few weeks, he was a happy model student. Whenever my grandfather would leave school late, he would see the dad playing basketball with his son after he got home from work. It was one of those moments that he took pride in, being able to make a difference in people's lives. However, not everything had such an easy solution, and my grandfather found himself having to deal with an employee, Stanley the janitor, who was showing up to work drunk. Stanley was an alcoholic with a mean streak, and my grandfather tried on multiple occasions to deal with his behavior. Finally, one day, Stanley showed up so drunk that my grandfather sent him home and called the superintendent to let him know he was going to fire him the next morning after he sobered up. He then warned them to let him deal with it when Stanley was sober, because he was not a stable person. As it goes in these kinds of stories, the superintendent was furious and decided that he was going to call Stanley himself and fire him despite my grandfather's warning. No one called my grandfather to tell him about it either, so he was completely in the dark and thought he could deal with it in the morning. Stanley was furious and went to the school that evening. He searched the offices, my grandfather's included, and tore things apart until he finally had what he wanted. He was in a blaze of fury, and on his way out, he saw the father and his son playing basketball. He walked towards them and pulled something out of his trousers. It was a gun. He then proceeded to shoot the little boy, killing him instantly. The father was so upset, hysterically crying, but somehow managed to get the gun away from Stanley and shoot him. My grandfather was called to the elementary school immediately by the police because there were 2 dead bodies. The little boy and Stanley were dead, but what was even worse was the crying from the father and him saying that he couldn't save his son. It was clear that he would never forgive himself for that day. My grandfather was pulled aside by one of the police, who had searched Stanley for evidence. They had found a hit list of the people that he was going to kill, and all of the addresses of those people that he had retrieved when he searched the offices. My grandfather was number 1 on that list. So, if it weren't for that father, it's likely that I would have never been able to meet my grandfather, and possibly my mother and grandmother would have been killed if Stanley had been able to complete his mission. To this day, I get goosebumps whenever I hear that story, and it's just so chilling. My grandfather never uttered a single word about this after his initial recount, and my mother made me swear to never tell him I knew. He carried the weight of that boy's death on him until the day he died. This story happened almost 11 years ago, in late summer 2006. I was an 18-year-old freshman in college. I went to a tiny college at the opposite end of the state. I lived in the basement of an old dorm. My floor was men only, but the floors above us were women, and the other side of the dorm was all men. I have some stories that are sort of creepy, but this one takes the cake, and at the time it didn't really click as creepy. I was young, naive, and full of, I was in the best shape of my life. 6'2", 180 pounds, handsome, etc. I'm 10 years older and 100 pounds heavier now. I was a young, good-looking college guy. In my dorm, there was a communal bathroom for all 20 guys to share. 2 stalls, 2 urinals, and 2 showers. That is it. One of the showers had an air vent that was about 7 feet up, but on the outside, it came out at ground level. One hot summer day, I was taking a shower and just talking and joking with the guy in the next shower behind me. All of a sudden, I heard someone else talking to me. I thought maybe someone had come into the bathroom and wanted to use the shower or something. That thought quickly left my head as I realized that the air vent had been opened, and the dorm's maintenance man and janitor were now looking at me through the vent. This guy was in his 50s and looked like the actor Clint Howard, the ugly redneck guy in a lot of Adam Sandler's 90s comedies. He had a thick Appalachian accent. He somehow knew my name. I don't remember giving it to him, but I had said hello to him a few times. He was also just trying to make small talk. It was very weird. I was weirded out by the college janitor peeping on me and then trying to start a conversation while I was showering. But for some reason, at the time, it didn't really register that what he was doing was super creepy and illegal. I just thought he was being weird, and I politely asked him to close the vent. The guy in the shower next to me quipped that the janitor did that all the time. He thought it was weird and creepy too, but harmless. They joked that the best time to shower was later at night, lest the perverted janitor try watching and starting a conversation. It was apparently a common occurrence on my floor. My floor was mostly made up of the freshman football players, and I guess the janitor liked to talk to these guys about the team and football through the air vent while watching them. Shudders at the thought. I would see the janitor occasionally around the dorm after that, but I never experienced him spying on me again, thankfully. I never told resident life or the college administration about the janitor doing those creepy things. This was in August or September 2006, so way past the time I could try to do anything. I hope maybe someone spoke up one day and maybe he was fired, but who knows? My story takes place in November 2004. I was around 9 years old at the time. I am 25 years old now, yet this memory has always stayed vividly at the forefront of my mind. I can remember it like it was yesterday, and it still makes me uneasy to think about. I've never spoken about it to anyone until now. It was a regular school day for me. It was the Friday before Thanksgiving break, and our school gave us a whole week off for it. I was particularly excited for that weekend because my parents were allowing my best friend to stay over for the weekend. It's all I could think about that day. I was a pickup student. This meant that for me to leave the school, a relative or guardian had to be on their records with a signature in order to pick me up from school. I was too anxious to ride the bus, and I was much too anxious to walk home alone, despite living in a friendly small town. That day, my grandma was supposed to pick me up from school. Both my parents were working late, so I was going to go to her house, and my mom was going to pick me up there after work. Well, you might be able to tell where this one is going to go. By the time school was out, my grandma was nowhere to be seen. I waited in the lobby for 30 minutes. By this point, it was empty besides the janitor mopping the lobby floor. I was getting nervous that my grandma forgot to pick me up. So I went up to tell the office lady that my ride never showed up. I was a nervous kid, and I didn't know what was happening. The lady was really nice. She sat me down in the office and tried calling my grandma. No luck. She tried calling my parents, who said grandma should have been there already. My mom said she reminded her this morning and would try calling her. She was at work for a few more hours and couldn't come get me yet. It was probably 4 p.m. at this point. I had been at school an extra hour, and I was really scared. I was all alone with the office lady, and I could tell she was frustrated. Everyone had already gone home, and she couldn't get on with her week off because of me. At one point, the janitor walked into the office. It instantly smelled like cigarettes when he walked in. He stared right at me. He was a tall, husky man with long, greasy brown hair, a bit of a screwed-up face, and a lopsided nose. That was the first time I had ever seen this man. I'd never seen him around school before. Considering the small town I was from, it was weird I didn't recognize him. His presence instantly made me nervous. I'll never forget what he looked like. He struck up a conversation with the office lady, I remember this part clearly. He asked her what she was still doing here. She told him and then nodded in my direction. He looked at me intently and sat down next to me. I can still smell the cigarettes to this day. "Hey kid, bet you're excited about Thanksgiving break. Bet you're excited for family time. Me too. Listen, your grandma's place is on the way to my house. I know her, and your grandpa too. I'd love to give you a ride over there. I know right where it is," he said to me. He continued, "I know it's scary to feel lost, but I'd love to help you out." He smiled at me. I looked over at the office lady. She looked gleeful that she wouldn't have to wait another hour with me for my mom to get there. She said, "Why, that would be great. My husband is waiting for me to get home now." He stood up and said, "Great." Without my permission, he grabbed my hand, pulled me out of my seat and said, "Let's get going then. Grandma must be worried about you." I shivered. I thought about what he said. He had said he knew my grandpa too. I didn't have a grandpa. He had passed long before I was born and divorced my grandma many years prior to that. I sat back down and shook my head without saying anything. He looked at me blankly, and the office lady looked disappointed. He walked out without saying anything. 5 p.m. rolled around, and my mom finally showed up to get me. It turns out my grandma had forgotten to set an alarm and was sleeping the whole time. When I went to my mom's car, I saw him again in the desolate staff parking lot, smoking a cigarette. He looked in our direction, got in his truck, and drove off. The thing that gives me shivers to this day is, he didn't drive towards my grandma's house. He took a left out of the school, which would have taken him out of town and towards the city. The complete opposite of where he said he was going. I never saw him at school again. I had never seen him before that. I have cried thinking over this so many times. I remember I had nightmares for years where the office lady made him take me with him so she could go home sooner. I attribute this to my development of anxiety and paranoia later in life. I was a junior at a small college majoring in sociology. Most of my core classes were in the same building, a really old single-story structure that they tore down a few years after I graduated. There was a janitor who was always in the building. Seriously, morning class, evening class. He was always there. My friends and I had mentioned him in passing, saying things like, "Oh, he's kind of creepy," because he would stare. My first encounter with him was when I used the tiny computer lab one evening. There were a couple of other people in there at the time, and the janitor came in with a broom and dustpan. He started sweeping, but in a nonchalant way, like he was just looking for an excuse to be there. He moved around the room and seemed to be looking at what everyone was doing on the computers. I got a bad vibe and wanted to leave, but the damn printer wasn't printing my paper. So he gets to my row and starts sweeping right under my chair. I was like, what the fuck? But I stared at my computer screen and just hoped he would move on. He did after about 30 seconds. Finally, my paper printed, and as he was standing there smiling, I grabbed it and left quickly. Creepy, but I thought, lesson learned, no more late trips to the lab. I saw him almost every time I was in the building, but the only time he said anything to me was a couple of weeks after that. He stared at me as I walked down the hall and then said, "I love you," as I walked out the door. Once again, I just stared straight ahead. Fast forward a couple of months. I was working with 3 other girls on a group project. We all had jobs in addition to classes, so our professor let us use one of the classrooms at night to work on the project. At around 10 or so at night, one of the girls and I went out to get food for everyone because we knew we had a few more hours to go. When we got back, the building was dark, but the bathrooms were within sight of the classroom, and I decided to go really quickly before diving back in. I walked in, and that creepy guy was standing there, just standing there in the girls' bathroom. He was staring at me with a smile. Even thinking about it now makes me want to barf. But I turned and ran back to the room. We closed the door and called campus security. The campus cop showed up, looked around the building and said, "There's no one here." He looked at me like I was making it up. The other girls wanted to stay and keep working, but I was pretty sure we were all going to get murdered at this point and just wanted to leave. They convinced me to stay. I wish I had the attitude then that I have now and went with my gut. So the cop left, and we got back to work. An hour passed. We heard one of the heavy doors open. The girl closest to the classroom door looked out, and the janitor was there. He said, "You look really beautiful tonight." She shut the door and started freaking out. We called campus security, but the janitor knocked on the door. We were all kind of panicking, wondering if we should pry open the windows and crawl out, make a run for it, or try to overpower him. He said something on the other side of the door, but we couldn't understand it very well. We decided 4 against 1 were good odds, so we gathered our stuff. We opened the door, and he was at the water fountain. He said, "I love you," and we just ran. We met campus security in the parking lot. They wouldn't file a report or take a complaint because nothing happened. We still had to see this guy around the building, but we were all pretty traumatized. I was close with a woman who worked in student affairs and told her about him. She said they all knew he was creepy, but he'd never actually touched anyone, so they couldn't do anything. It still pisses me off that this guy got away with stalking and freaking out people.